Welcome to Cancer and Peace. My name is Sean Stewart, here to facilitate a conversation with my good friend and 20-year cancer journeyer, Peter Scalzo. And he's our
Sean.
host for today.
Hey.
Welcome. We've been bantering for a little while now.
Yeah.
We have a guest in our studio
We
who's
do.
refusing to participate with
know.
our conversation today.
Yeah.
Do you want to at least introduce her, though, so that people know who's listening in while we're doing this?
She is my co-ministry leader from church who we actually lead a cancer support group together. It sounds like we're going to rename it to Cancer Journeying Group or something like that. But she is here today to watch and help, and I don't think she's going to say anything, though.
We've been trying to get her to, but she won't.
No.
So we're going to get less wisdom today, but we're going to go in anyway without her help.
That's right.
And
So,
hopefully one day we'll be able to drag her in, right?
Yeah.
So Peter is wearing his usual, the same outfit he wears every time in his minimalistic style. So if you want to get a feel of that, you can dial in on YouTube and see Peter in his de minimis.
Wonderful
Yeah.
wardrobe.
I don't mean de minimis in covering. I mean de minimis in.
Yeah, thank God for that.
Yes, I've been thankful many times for that.
Yeah, me too.
So welcome. We're gonna go a different direction though. We just finished up a series that had 6 parts, and we called it the Stages of a Cancer Journey. And so today's we're gonna wander into something else, I think, right?
Yeah, I think so.
And so the thought processes we were kicking around, it's like an important part of our journey, of our spiritual journey, is the ability to lament. And we were thinking about biblical characters who did that really well. And the one that you had picked out was David.
Yeah.
And we know that 2/3 of the Psalms are laments.
Mm-hmm.
And so Peter tried to make it my job to come up with the one we were going to pick. I was like, no, the host has to do this. And so today you did pick one finally, after he tried to shirk his duties onto me. I'm going to use that word today for this context. Is that okay?
And just a little background from me. So for so long, I think the first 10 years of my cancer journey, I put on a somewhat positive face pretty much all the time. And in my evangelicalness, I pretty much said, everything's going to be good. Everything is good. And I was experiencing lots of surgeries. And then I got up to that 14th surgery mark that we've talked about before, and when the situation became metastatic. And I entered into this really difficult, depressed state, devastated state. And I ended up in the rawness of that moment and in my own emotional journey through that process of actually lamenting. And it was just my honest, raw emotions being poured out to God in a very honest, authentic fashion, saying, I don't like this. And I don't understand what's going on. And I'm upset. I'm angry. I'm fearful. And I'm sad about what's going on. And it just sort of came out. And I was not a student of emotionally healthy spirituality at all at that point. But I did. I journaled these raw emotions. They came out. And of course, we've talked about how productive that is to let those raw emotions come out. And then I ended up doing that journey with my journal and going into a place of walking in truth, we called, and really getting to a place of peace, even though my diagnosis and prognosis didn't change. And so later on in the journey, because I'm still journeying in the cancer space, I started to participate in a program called Emotionally Healthy Spirituality that I mentioned, and found out that lamenting is something that's done all through Scripture. Didn't really know.
Yeah.
Had read Scripture my whole life, but didn't pay attention. And until he pointed out 2/3 of the Psalms are laments. Jeremiah lamented, even wrote Lamentations. Christ even laments in the Garden of Gethsemane, but there's all these places in Scripture where these biblical characters lament.
Yeah.
So I thought, well, I guess it's part of the process then, right?
Yeah, I think I like Scalzo's work in here. He has this concept he calls enlarge your soul through grief and loss.
Mm-hmm.
And on the surface, you're like, what do you mean enlarge your soul? It doesn't make sense in a sense. But feeling like your internal suffering, the pain that's going on inside of you, the big part of lament, I think it's not just, you mentioned an evangelical thing. I think it's like a Western culture thing that we don't grieve, lament as much in a well. Like if you look at other cultures, like maybe even if you watch like a Middle East funeral, that they'll have mourners, that they'll have wailers, they'll have all that kind of, the thing that goes around that is it's almost expected to express emotion and the feelings of loss for a death or something like that. And that you would see a lot that when you actually told me you had just been in at some, you've been like a funeral, like a Tenderlace.
Been going to like, a lot of them, yeah.
Is there funeral food happening after these? Are you going and crashing funerals, or are you actually, are these real?
Yeah.
Okay, just making sure because.
Yeah.
But yeah, you got to experience some different expressions in our own culture from different Christian traditions, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But I noticed that in the areas that where I grew up, especially, it was the idea of, well, we had to celebrate the life, and we almost pretended. It was this idea of, it wasn't okay to show emotion. I remember my mom passing from her cancer journey, and I felt like I didn't have permission. Not that anybody said no. It was just like the idea of, you would go around, look how strong she is, or look how strong he is, would be the kind of words, because they didn't show emotion.
Right.
And they were communicating a message that, oh, hey, if you cry, if you allow your loss, your grieving to be released, they're communicating a message that you're weak and you're not doing it right. It was kind of the message that I was being given in my formative years experience. And so to me, it was a complete upside down kind of world whenever, Scalzo and some of these people are just like, no, grief and loss is something that we should experience. And when you trap that emotional experience, that the not letting that grief and loss to be felt and explained, it's like storing trauma in your body. It's you're storing something up that it's always fascinating. We would listen to like a recovery, for my own personal, I remember when we got into the recovery journey and I started sharing some of my formative year story and my life story, there was all this trapped emotion. And in the midst of trying to share my story, it would leak out like this uncontrollable something. It's like, where did that come from? Yeah, where did that come from? And it was like, as soon as there were cracks in the dam of allowing some of that stored emotion to kind of come to the surface, it had so much pressure. It was just like, imagine a dam that had a crack in it. It was just like, shooting out there. And then the number of times now I see people that start telling their life story and they can't control the emotion, but they can't say what it's coming from either. It's just, I start to share my story and now here it is, this emotion comes over them. And I think for many of us, because we weren't given permission to have emotion, to express our lament, our loss, to really, I never processed my mom's death with the grief. I put a smile on my face and acted like everything was fine.
Yeah.
And I think that's the culture that I was raised in. That's the way it was supposed to be in the mind. And so, and I've had this concept for a while, and I've shared it on the podcast before, but I'll put it out there. It's more of a hypothesis. I'm not a psychologist or whatever that I could really say for sure. But this idea of, when I hear Scalzo talk about enlarge your soul through grief and loss, what I hear is when you allow yourself to grieve, so you've been filled up with this capacity of emotion that has completely, taken part of your inner person and filled it up, and you allow it to process and you express your own emotion, you get to the end of feeling that, there's room left now for me to have the ability to have emotional empathy to enter into your pain. And my soul is large enough to actually walk into other people's pain, but I've never processed my own. I've only pushed it's almost like my soul or my spirit is a balloon. I've pushed it out with my own grief and loss, and there's not room for anybody else's. But if I can process on my own and let that go back to a size that it's been released, it's been experienced, it's been felt through, I've reduced the trauma in my own life, and I've also made room to be able to experience your grief and loss, your pain, to hear your story and to feel emotion with you when you share your story. And so, in a sense, my soul's been enlarged through my own grief and loss and has given me capacity to experience yours also, is the way I interpret that a bit. And it's not scientific or anything, but the more I'm able to process my own story, is the way I think about it, is what I've found in my own personal life, the more I can step into your story and feel your suffering and pain and walk beside you, not in a perfect sense, but in a sense of empathetically, in a sense of being able to enter into your grief with you, your loss with you. And I think there's something meaningful about that.
Yeah, so experiencing my own grieving, allowing myself to grieve, helps me to step into your grief too. And I was thinking, I mean, in my formation spiritually, I don't know if I probably would have said, I think it's a failure of faith if you grieve too much.
Me too.
There's something wrong there. And I remember the scene of waking up after this 10-hour surgery the next morning in ICU, and the news, 5% survival chance, all that. And my wife and my son sitting there, and I could not control the emotion of sadness and loss and grief at that point, and just wept. I don't think they had ever seen me weep, and I had been married for quite some time. So I was like a robot. I was robotic and not allowing myself to feel sadness and grief and loss. And consequently, I deadened myself to joy, happiness, and some of those emotions too. So I had an undeveloped emotional inner life. And yet the scriptures were glaring in front of me. I mean, that culture knew grieving was a natural part of how they conducted themselves with loss. And, Jesus at the tomb of Lazarus is a wonderful example of him grieving, weeping at loss. So it is a natural thing. And the cancer journey, there are losses that are experienced through the whole journey. And whether it's physically, you're losing, there's a new limit placed on you. Emotionally, suddenly now you have to process being a cancer patient, all that sort of stuff. And, there may even be the prospect of losing your life. You may even step into that situation, metastatic, and then loss of life. So there's a lot of loss to process.
I want to highlight something you said. There was something I just found to be fairly profound about, and you highlighted, but Brene Brown did a lot of research in the space, and she's put a lot of stuff on the web. But that idea of, if you stuff the hard emotions, the grief, the loss, the anger, sadness, despair, all these harder emotions, if you stuff those, you also stuff joy. You can't selectively stuff. You can't pick which emotions you want to stuff. And so if you want to experience joy, beauty, and all these other areas of your life, you have to, part of enlarging your soul is to take those on so you can experience the other side of that. And selectively stuffing, I don't think we realize it when we're not grieving, but we are stuffing. When we don't grieve, we're stuffing that hard emotion, and that means we're missing out on some of the whatever our stuffing mechanism is. And for some, it could be drinking, but or drugs or something like that. But it may be just, I immerse myself into work. So if you get into a cancer journey, if you don't want to feel, the suffering side of this, you may immerse yourself into busyness, work, and something that's distracting. But you're also not just stuffing the feeling of loss, you're stuffing the ability to experience the same joys that are present, that are to be experienced in the journey also. The joy of being loved and cared for, and to have God journey alongside you is a great joy, but you have to feel the loss to do that. I think. And so by that Brene Brown, if you haven't watched some of her work out there, I think she's done a really good job of putting some short segments out there showing how she's researched people who are wholehearted. What were the characteristics? And the characteristics were people who were willing to open themselves up to not feeling, to shame is our biggest block. And they were willing to take on and put out the harder parts of it, to share openly the areas where you might feel shame, where there's risk. Those were the people who had the most joy in their lives because they were willing to risk the pain of rejection or anything else that goes along with that. And so it's a really fascinating thing. And I think it fits well with why do we need to lament? And it's because it's part of our processing that we don't want to get stuck and hold trauma of death and loss. We want to express that so we can experience the fullness of life on the other side. It's not because I just want to feel the hard stuff. It's I want to feel all the good stuff that goes along too.
I think us guys too. I think it's
don't blame us, dude.
I think women have a tendency to be better grievers. They have a tendency to feel more free, at least with their
I know some pretty hard women though, so I know what you're saying.
But I feel like guys a lot of times are feel like they have to be the strong, independent, rocks. And
I think a feminine characteristic that we see is they're more expressive more time, and so we act like that is willingness to share crying more, something like that, because as a guy, if you get hit in the face, you're supposed to put on this tough guy. Well, that didn't hurt, so, but I think the meaning behind grief and loss though is more universal. It's not so much about showing masculinity and feminine characteristics. Right. I think this is about showing real, and that's something different than, hey, what shell we wear on the outside, I think. But maybe that's for a different conversation in a different sense. But I think where we're at today, there are perceptions, but I've talked to my own wife. She's like, I think women can be the most closed off because they have to meet certain standards in the feminine space. And so that's why you hear some level of defense. Like I see some of the things that she struggles with finding deep connection with women, because there are different kinds of walls. We have a woman here. Maybe she could comment on that here with our podcast, but she's shaking her head. She's just letting us ramble. I wanted to, if we can, you picked out, and because I forced you to.
There's a scripture that
demonstrates this, or really what it looks like.
The thing I love about King David is that he lets us into these windows in his life. One of them is a great sin that he had committed, adultery, murder. He lets us into the process of what he did, and then the process of how he repented and was restored. And I find that fascinating because it didn't have to be in the scriptures, but it is. It's extremely helpful. But he also lets us into these really difficult struggles that he had when he was fleeing Saul, or he was on the run, and so he has laments that are part of the Psalms that he actually wrote.
Yeah, and I want to highlight one more thing in that is, like you said, he was restored, and yes, he was restored in his role, but he still. That loss wasn't restored. Right. There was a loss of a child based upon those actions that he had to live with. He had to embrace the suffering of that, and that it wasn't changed. God didn't restore that child. He had another child, I think many other childs actually, but that loss was real, and it was a direct result of his sin. And so that was a burden, a weight he had to carry. And so it's not always that the loss is restored. It is having to learn how to live with the loss, I think, too, is what I like about thinking about, where he's at in his journey.
That's a great point about.
But there was restoration too. So it's both. It's just understanding there's a lot of complexity to the story, which makes it really interesting about, his journey, is that, yes, his sin, his suffering, his repentance, and his expressing the lament and the loss. There was restoration of his role as the king, and he wasn't rejected the same way. When Saul, the first king, came with his sin, he didn't repent and turn back. And so there wasn't restoration, God said, I'm going to take the kingdom from you.
Mm-hmm.
And he does.
Mm-hmm.
With David, he repents and God doesn't take the kingdom from him, but he says the sword will always be in your household because of this. And that was something that he's going to have to live with, that lament. And it was. You see it through the rest of the family history that the sword was always there. There was always struggle and fighting in the family. And so there's all these really complex tensions, but he was restored in his kingship. And in some sense, you see the fulfillment. Jesus comes in the line of David and fulfills this. So this is great fulfillment too. So there's the joy because David's able to deal with the tensions of great loss and yet restoration and hope. Mm-hmm. And he has to be able to point to that hope in his life, in a sense. And we see the fulfillment, but it wasn't during his lifetime. Really fascinating story when you think about all the pieces that come together, I think, with, but it all stems back to this loss too.
Yeah.
We're going to do the Psalm, aren't we?
Well, you want to do the first part of it? Because there's some...
Are you trying to make me read this, or am I?
No, you're reading it.
Remember, I don't have my glasses here with me.
Oh, you don't have your glasses. Okay, ready? So this is Psalm 69, David speaking, and this is from the Message version. God, save me! I'm in over my head. Quicksand under me, swamp water over me. I'm going down for the third time. I'm hoarse from calling for help, bleary-eyed from searching the sky for God. I've got more enemies than hairs on my head. Liars and cheats are out to knife me in the back. What I never stole, must I now give back? You want me to keep going, or
do one more? I think this next one's...
God, you know every sin I've committed. My life's a wide open book before you.
Yeah, that's a really...
You like that?
Yeah. So he doesn't claim sinlessness.
No.
He actually talks about the tensions there. He's like, am I being punished for sins I didn't commit? And then, but I am a sinner. My book's open. You know me. He's expressing both that. And I think that's something that's really important in our own journeys, is to... One of the big things that I find in my own is when I'm in stress, I tend to go to the binary. It's all good or it's all bad. And what I see here is somebody who is actually writing down the truth of what's going on. There are people who are out to kill me. And I think when he's talking about his emotional state, he's like, I'm in over my head, and he's expressing being overwhelmed. And I love the fact that he uses quicksand under and swamp water. Like in the Message version, it's such a descriptive, it's not fresh water that's rushing over me. No. It's swamp water.
Yeah. And quicksand under.
And quicksand under you. It's like, it is a place of deep despair.
Yeah.
And, so that level of expression is it has so much honesty, and you can feel it, right? You can feel just the level of intensity of where he's at by the descriptions he put.
Yeah, so I can relate. Especially at different parts in my cancer journey, but after that 14th surgery of quicksand under me and swamp water over me.
Your words were, it's dark and getting darker.
Yeah, I actually wanted to tap out. So I get that feeling overwhelmed. And I was a man of faith at the time, strong relationship with God, but I was overwhelmed and I was undone by it. And I thought how unhealthy it is for me to be in this place at the time. I felt, oh man, I'm really failing at this journey. Oh God, I am such a failure.
Yeah.
That's what I thought at that time.
How do you feel about it now? When you think about it now, when you enter that moment?
Yeah, I feel how wonderful it is.
That's very different.
To be able to express real feelings to my Jesus, who I have an intimate relationship with. He wants to hear the realness, and I want to be able to tell him the realness.
Has the hardness of the experience changed?
No.
The pain from the experience changed? No. So only your interpretation has changed.
Yeah.
And your belief about how it changed. how did that happen? How did you change from self-condemnation to
I think it's because
this is a wonderful thing that I was able to express this way?
Yeah, because I understand emotions differently now as a Christian, that God actually speaks through them. They do have a purpose and a plan, that God has a special plan for my emotional life. Doesn't mean my emotions have to rule over me. In other words, to regulate emotions is a good thing, to manage them. But before, I was just stuffing them. I wouldn't give any life to them. So now I intentionally ask myself every day, am I hurting, exhausted, angry, resentful, tense? Those questions, fear, anger, and sadness. Am I experiencing these things? Why? I'm going to process it. How much more healthier that is.
Yeah, I'd like Scazzaro used that. He would say your body is a major prophet, not a minor prophet. So you just went and said, hey, I go listen to the prophet. And what is it telling me about me? And I just did an Adam Young conference this last weekend, and it was really good because they spent time with Dr. Hillary McBride, and she's done a lot of work in the space of your body and healing in your body, kind of thinking about how we tend to categorize our soul and spirit over here and our body over here. And it was very similar. It was your body does not lie. It doesn't mean that you understand what it's saying, but if you're feeling pain, if you're feeling something somewhere in your gut and wherever it is, that it's telling you something that you should listen to. And so I love the fact that you're saying, hey, I do this heart check, or you're looking at, being able to feel anger, sadness, but do I feel tensions? Because that's what I like to do too. It's like, do I feel anxiety when I wake up in the morning? Because if I do, I want to know where it's coming from, because my body usually knows before my mind does, which is an amazing thing about, I think part of grieving is feeling, is what we're really talking about. And if we think about what David's doing, is he's expressing his feeling. And I love the fact that you said, hey, I found it's okay to feel. It's not wrong to feel, because your body is not lying to you. It's telling you something. And
I think of like my relationship with my higher power, Jesus, to be a conversation. Like you and I are good friends. And if you were having a rough day or a rough time, I would want you to tell me about it. I want to listen, because then I know more about you. I hear your heart. I know you better. And I just kind of feel the same way with my relationship with Jesus. Jesus wants to hear my feelings poured out, how I'm actually doing, the realness of who I am and what I'm feeling. And I appreciate that about Jesus.
Yes, it's a big, one of our mutual friends had tied me into this concept, and it's something we've been really applying more in some of the ministry circles you and I have been running in now. And it is, we call it sitting in the dirt. And so sitting in the dirt is such a great place, because I have found that a lot of times somebody would call and they would have really hard message news, not towards me, but about their own journey. And the first thing I want to do is say something like, well, it's going to be okay. And as I got to think about it, that's a fix. Because, and the reason why it's a fix is, what I'm really saying is, I don't want to enter into your pain. I need to give you words of comfort so that I don't feel uncomfortable about what you're sharing. And sitting in the dirt is, wow, that must be really hard right now. Let me be in this with you. I don't know if it's going to be okay. I don't know whether it's going to get better or worse. I was doing that with a mutual friend of ours, you and I have, that had called, and he was in a really hard place. And man, it's a big difference to be able to sit there and just go, yeah, I don't have an answer for you. But I'll be here with you in that. I can feel how much this is hurting you myself. I feel it in my own spirit, not to the degree that you're at, because you're, the first person experiencer of this, but as somebody who's sitting here with you, I can feel it with you. And this is hard. I don't have an answer if it's going to get better. In fact, I don't think, for the next little bit, it was going to be better. And so it's like,
and that, I thought I had my 7th recurrence going on not that long ago.
Yes.
And we talked about it on this podcast, but I forget what episode. And I was explaining to our men's group, storywork group, that this was going on. And one of our guys just started to weep.
Yes.
And he had to get off camera and stuff. And that brought me into a place of weeping also, seeing him weep. I hadn't taken the time yet to actually explore my own emotions with this new recurrence that and so it was helpful to have someone sit, the whole group did, sat in the dirt with me. That was helpful for me to allow my own emotions to come out.
Is it crazy to think that maybe he experienced the pain before you did?
Yeah, he did.
Experienced it.
Yes.
Allowed himself to feel it. Maybe it's a better, like
Yeah.
you
I
had the initial shock experience. I'm having a recurrence here and it doesn't look good and I don't want to go through this, but then he allowed himself to feel it before you allowed yourself to feel it.
As I watched him, I'm like, oh yeah, maybe I should be allowing myself to feel that too. Like, holy cow. Yeah. But it's interesting because when I do allow myself to grieve, lament, and sadness, and might be some anger that comes out. This last recurrence, I had some anger come out. After I let it come out and process it and say, okay, then I can enter into a place of, okay, Lord, let's do this together. Let's journey in this area together. Why don't you partner with me? And then I go to a healthy place. If I skip over the lament step, then I haven't allowed myself to experience that piece of it, and I don't get to the same place of healing.
And this isn't okay, I cried it out for 5 minutes and now it's over. No. It's, there's going to be layers of this that you're going to process of your journey. And my father-in-law just passed away, a couple weeks ago. And, it was interesting because my wife watched this conference with me, and they had this person. He was on an early Alzheimer's journey, and I told you about this story of this woman who was nonverbal Alzheimer's, and how this lady came and ministered to her in this medical facility, and by entering into her suffering and pain with her, but physically touching her. And she sang to her, and she connected at a physical level. And within 3 minutes, this woman who was nonverbal sang with her. And I was absolutely blown away. And then I turned and I looked at my wife, and she was just bawling because she was like connected immediately, her dad on this Alzheimer's journey, and the intensity of her feeling the grief, the connection, all of that. And it's like all those layers are going to come out as time, but that's the moment to allow yourself to feel, is to, when it's brought to the surface, feel it, experience it. It's loss. I'm sure the thoughts that we're going through is like, I wish I could have had that connection with my dad before he passed. And that's a lament. She didn't have that, and there's a loss there. There's a great loss. And is it okay for her to feel it and experience it in that moment? And I think she has for her soul to be enlarged, and to feel the joy again of that, what she did have with her dad. And to, there's a lot of depth there with that it's doing what David's doing in the Psalm here. It's like, oh, that's beautiful. And then, oh, that actually makes my loss big here too. Yeah. Well, we're getting at 30 minutes in here, and we haven't finished this psalm. What do you want to do?
No, I think the psalm does change, right? The tone of it. I mean, as you read through it, not too much, a little bit.
I think something to.
Oh, yeah, no, it kind of, when I poured myself out in prayer and fasting, all it got me was more contempt.
Yeah.
When I put on a sad face, they treated me like a clown. I know what that feels like.
We might actually want to talk about this more in
Yeah.
our next episode, just carry this on, because I think
Well, it's a long song.
one of the things that is important about it is there's certain psalms that don't end with a smiley face. And
Yeah.
I think that's why this is such an important thing. Is like not everything is going to have a smiley face,
Mm-hmm.
but we know David's story. He experienced life
Mm-hmm.
and expression, and sometimes we leave it with God at that.
Mm-hmm.
We're in the dirt, and He's listening, and He's not coming to smack at us. He's not coming to condemn us. It's, hey, I'm in this suffering with you, and sitting in the dirt. And I think that's like, if you're going to find real peace, it's like God is sitting here with you, and maybe not everything's fixed and put together, but God is here with us. And I think you've, in your own journey, have got to that place.
Yeah.
When I look at your own journal and how you got there, it wasn't that you knew you were going to be healed. It was you got to a place, and it took like 30 or 40 days, I think, into your journey before you got to, it's not dark and getting darker. It is, God is with me, but I have no idea if I'm still at the 5% chance of survival. It looks like it, but God is here with me. And so now the light was shining, and you could actually experience the light with the exact same circumstances. The circumstances hadn't changed, and they didn't change for some time.
Ecclesiastes, where it talks about there's a purpose for everything, every season under the sun, and there is a time to weep is one of those seasons under the sun that there is a purpose in that weeping. And my situation didn't change for some time, and the whole journey really continues. It's 20 years now, so yeah.
So I guess I'm going to wrap us up here. Just for today is like, I think you hear us talking about lament and the importance of it. And my encouragement is if you're feeling something, allow it to feel, and get yourself in a community that accepts that feeling, and recognize that culture around here is probably many ways is discouraging us from feeling, or there's so many coping mechanisms that are asking us that, even I think subconsciously, to stuff those feelings. And one of the great joys of going through this journey is to let go of all of that and begin the process of lament. And I know that if you haven't listened to Peter's journals, where he took the process, a great way to go back, and we have some episodes back where you journaled for, we went through a few weeks of just reading Peter's journal and searching it and then feeling the feelings of those even again. But you expressed, similar to this psalm, your darkness, what you walked through. And there is a hope in the other side of that, because there is light. Not that your circumstances didn't change, before we ended that journal, but you were able to experience the peace, which I think, this Cancer and Peace is what this podcast is about. You got to a place of peace by lament. And that's why I think we're exploring this a bit even now.
Yeah. Yep.
So
Thanks, Sean.
thanks everyone for listening. Blessings to all of you.
Jack.
Donna, great for being here today. And producer Jack.